Most of what we cover in this early training is focused on the semantics and syntax of JavaScript. You will learn the syntax rule in each lesson as we cover different features of the language, but in this video, the plan is to cover some of the most basics of the syntax rules, and those have to do with semicolon, the use of semicolon, how to name your variables, and how to write comments. So let's get started with semicolons. So most statements in JavaScript must end with a semicolon. JavaScript also has an automatic semicolon insertion, or ASI. Well, at least most engines that implement the specs of JavaScript have this. And so if you omit a semicolon, the engine will try to insert one for you. And that's why if you look at JavaScript code, you may find some people don't use that at all. In fact, there are developers who have a strong preference on not using semicolon. Now, I personally prefer to use semicolon, and the reason I prefer to do that is, well, firstly, I'm more comfortable because I'm coming from languages similar to C, and secondly, the behavior of ASI can be problematic in some cases. So let's first off look at the example where we use semicolon, sort of normal writing statements like declarations, initialization, print statements, regular expressions. These all end with a semicolon, and that all works fine. And if you remove any of these semicolons, as I'm doing right now, and run the code again, the same thing runs, no problem. There's no compilation error, everything works. Now let's take a look at an example where not inserting semicolon could be problematic. For example, look at this statement. Now this is a contrived example. Arguably, you're not going to end up writing code like this. But this is just for the purposes of demonstration that if I write something like X and then in the next line I have plus plus and then the next line I have Y, I'm not going to get a compiler error. Like the program is not going to stop me and be like, hey, what is it that you're doing? This code is fine. It's just going to run, and we are at the mercy of ASI, however it's going to interpret this. So some implementation may interpret this as X semicolon and then increment Y semicolon. Others may interpret this as X plus plus semicolon and then Y semicolon. So in one version you may end up incrementing Y, in another one you may end up incrementing X. And again, this is a extreme case. It's a contrived example, but just the idea is that it shows that it depends on ASI implementation. Even if you do include semicolons everywhere in the code, ASI can still create issues for you. For example, if you have a statement in front of your return keyword, and let's say what you have here, and in my example is just a value for simplicity, but sometimes you may have a long statement, and if it doesn't quite fit in the screen, you may want to hit an enter and bring that statement on the next line. Now, in a language like Java, C, or C++, that would be okay because you didn't end this statement with a semicolon, so it understands it needs to go to the next line and actually read the expression. In JavaScript, however, because ASI exists, what will happen is that it will automatically insert a semicolon at the end of the return statement for you. And so you end up returning nothing from getValue rather than returning 42. So again, this is somewhat of a rare case that might happen, but it is there to showcase that things can go wrong when a language implements a feature like this. My recommendation to you is to use semicolon. That's a recommendation that a lot of JavaScript linters and formatters also promote by default. For example, there is a program called Prettier, and it's a very famous and commonly used formatter for JavaScript, and its default is to insert semicolon for all of your statements. All right, so let us move to the next topic that I want to talk about, and that's about identifier naming rules. Now, for most part, these are similar to what you've seen in languages like Java and C++. Let's take a look at an example. So you can basically use any letters, numbers, $, and underscore when it comes to naming identifiers. And identifiers are things like the name of the variables, name of the functions, classes, and so on. And so all of these, the example that you see on this slide, this all works. Like many other programming languages, you should not be starting a variable name with a number. So if I were to uncomment this line, and run this code again, it's going to give me a syntax error. So this is problematic. Now, when it comes to naming your variables, even though it is possible that you start a variable with a $sign or with an underscore, my recommendation is to avoid doing that. And the reason is that there are some fairly popular JavaScript libraries that use this convention to name their own identifiers. For example, there's a library called Lodash that uses underscore to name its identifiers like functions and variables that it has. jQuery used to be a very popular JavaScript library. It's not as popular anymore, but jQuery used to name all its identifiers with a $sign. So because these are commonly used by other libraries, I would recommend that you would not use them in your own scripts. Now, one other thing it's worth mentioning is that the identifiers are case sensitive. So if I were to go here and, for example, change this first name and change the N in name and change it to a lowercase, I would run this code again, then it's going to give me a reference error that first name is not defined. So on top of this, there are, like any other programming language, reserved words. These are identifiers that are reserved for other purposes and you shouldn't be using them for most part. These are very intuitive, things like function keyword, class keyword, if statements, for loop, while loop, and the variable declaration keywords like var, let, const, and a bunch more. So if you end up using one of those, you usually get a error, and editors are also very good at highlighting these for you. All right, we're gonna wrap things up by talking about comments. So comments in JavaScript are very similar to how you put comments in Java. So you can have single line comments with 2//, and anything basically comes after 2// will be ignored by the JavaScript engine. And then you also have multi-line block comments that are enclosed between /* and an enclosing */. And so you can also use the block comments to comment out part of a line, like in this example that you see here on my slide. All right, so what we learned today, we covered the basic syntax rules you need to know. Always use semicolon, follow the identifier naming rules, and use comments to document your code. These fundamentals will help you write cleaner and more predictable JavaScript code.